Thank you very much to Art Sonje Center and the British Council for inviting me to Korea to talk about the weather. So for as long as human beings have communicated with words, that's what we've done. We talked about the weather. It's often small talk, of course, a way of starting a conversation. But talking about the weather today is not the same as talking about the weather at any other time in the history of human beings on this planet. It's why around 35,000 people from 120 countries around the world are all gathered in Egypt this week for COP27. And the language we use is having to change fast to keep up. Not so long ago, we talked of climate change, then climate crisis, and now climate emergency. And just 2 days ago at COP27, the UN Secretary General said we are on the highway to climate hell. So the weather we talk about every day, the heat, cold, wind, storms, fog, and so on, is produced within the thin membrane of air and moisture above the Earth, the biosphere that sustains human life. And the French philosopher Bruno Latour has called this area the critical zone. This is where our climate is formed. The critical zone is fragile, it's unstable, and it's changing fast. And there's a word from the Anglo-Saxon English, at least 1,000 years old, called unweather. In modern English, unweather. It's not a word that we use, but perhaps we should. And unweather describes weather so extreme that it seems to have come from another climate, another time altogether. The weather gods in Anglo-Saxon England were often angry, as were the gods in ancient Greece, or the ministers of cloud, rain and wind in the time of, and excuse me if I get this wrong, Gojoseon. The world is heating up everywhere, and the effects of this heating are intensifying. In England, we think of our weather as temperate, as a prompt for conversation, more than an existential threat. But on July the 18th this year, the Met Office in England issued its first ever red extreme heat warning for the UK, as temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit were recorded for the very first time. That same threshold was breached 2 years ago in a place we think of as cold, in the Siberian town of Verkhoyansk in the Arctic Circle. The North and South Poles are the most dramatic measure of the climate emergency, the places where the temperature is rising the most quickly. And the changes are so extreme that the Arctic could have ice-free summers within 30 years, and the glaciers in the Himalayas are on course to lose at least a third of their ice over the same period. In May this year, it was so hot in New Delhi that the mercury rose above 100 degrees Fahrenheit every day bar one through May. One day, a temperature of over 120 degrees was recorded, and birds, exhausted by the heat, were falling from the sky. And this year, China has experienced, according to the China Meteorological Association, the worst heat wave on record. Extreme heat can lead to intense flooding, as hot air holds more moisture. A third of Pakistan has been underwater as a result of the torrential rainfall. And there were terrible floods in Seoul, of course, this summer. This extreme weather, this unweather, is the context in which the World Weather Network was conceived last year. So before we look at some of the activities of the network, I'd like to take a quick look in the rear view window of weather to sketch very briefly how our understanding of weather and climate have developed over recent centuries, and how this shaped the thinking behind the way the World Weather Network was set up and operates. Each and every culture, modern and ancient, has had its own way of understanding and talking about the weather. Reading the skies, predicting the onset of storms, monsoons, typhoons, hurricanes, heat waves, freezing, was often, and it still is today, a matter of life and death. When is it best to sow and harvest crops? When best to set out to sea, to undertake a journey across land, or to wage war? So today, of course, farmers and seafarers and travelers and politicians have access to real-time information and sophisticated projections of future weather based on huge amounts of data. At the same time, most of us still draw on collective knowledge and weather memory formed over centuries through our intimate relationship with the environment. The two are not mutually exclusive, and indeed meteorology, the study of weather, has deep roots in cosmology and in folklore. From these deep roots, the speculations and observations of scientists, physicists, mathematicians, geologists and meteorologists, the imaginings of artists, painters, poets, songwriters, storytellers, and the daily records of people observing the weather have all played a formative role in our evolving understanding of weather and climate. So I worked on this talk in London, here in the Senate House Library, which is where Art Sonje's Weather Station is located. And the library houses a rich collection of books about weather and climate, and we're showing a small selection showing how different elements that make up the weather are on display. The history of recording and measuring the weather goes back many centuries, and to just give one example, in Korea, during the Joseon dynasty, the world's first rain gauge, Segogi, was invented in 1441, and a rainfall observation network was built on a national scale. So obviously my perspective is from London and from Europe, and many of the books in the library came from the late 18th century onwards, when scientists and philosophers in Europe observed and measured and gathered various weather phenomena with the aim of creating a more systematic way of understanding and forecasting or predicting the weather. So in 1783, the curiosity of an amateur meteorologist called Luke Howard was sparked by a summer haze in London, which in itself was caused by a volcanic eruption in Iceland. And this is a page from Luke Howard's The Climate of London. It was the first study to document the effect of air pollution on the urban climate. Howard then went on to study the clouds, producing this famous system of classification, which he published in 1802. At the same time, a commander in the British Navy, Admiral Beaufort, introduced a system to classify wind speeds, which became known and still is today called the Beaufort scale. Alongside these scientific advances, in Britain, artists began to pay much closer attention to the sky, most notably Turner, next please, and Constable. "I am the man of clouds," Constable famously wrote in 1823. And new forms of communication, next please, also played a crucial role in building the new system of knowledge, especially the invention of the telegraph. So what does all this mean? It means that weather reporting was no longer the result of observations in one place. It was an accumulation of more or less simultaneous observations from different places gathered together. Weather patterns became weather systems, and weather became a network. And meteorological offices were set up in various imperial cities in Europe. First Vienna in 1851, then in London in 1854, led by Admiral Robert Fitzroy. And daily reports were sent from a constellation of weather stations around the coast of Britain back to the centre, and weather began to be understood as a complex system of causes and effects of atmospheric pressures in constantly shifting patterns. And with data coming in each day from coastal weather stations, next please, Fitzroy was able to predict what the weather might look like in the near future. He came up with the term forecasting the weather, and by 1875 the first daily weather forecasts were being published in the Times newspaper. The same principle underpins the way weather is forecast today, but the amounts of data used are almost unimaginable. There's a new supercomputer at the Met Office in England that takes in 215 billion weather observations every day and runs atmospheric modelling containing more than 1 million lines of code. But however sophisticated the modelling, firstly, it's not always right, and secondly, many climate scientists agree that something else is needed. Other ways of measuring and observing different voices and stories. We need a multiplicity of perspectives. And this mirrors the argument of the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh, who wrote that the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and of the imagination. And he called for a heightened imaginary response to the emergency, which breaks with conventional narratives and embraces the complex entanglements of history with our present and future. And so, in response to the climate emergency, a constellation of 28 arts organizations around the world came together last year to create the World Weather Network. It was launched on the summer solstice this year, June the 21st. And over the course of the year, artists and writers, sometimes working with climate scientists and environmentalists, are sharing what we call weather reports from different weather stations around the world. So where are the weather stations? They're observatories and lighthouses, forests and deserts, coastlines and cities across the Indian subcontinent, the Southern Pacific, the Middle East, from the Amazon rainforest to the Swiss Alps, from London and Athens to Johannesburg and Seoul. And their observations, stories, images, imaginings about their local weather and our shared climate are creating an archipelago of voices and viewpoints on the platform. And here's the first special report produced as an introduction. Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize we wouldn't have sound, so this will just give you an idea of the different places where the weather reports are coming from. And you know, the network is still young. Seoul Weather Station is actually the first fully formed weather station. So there's much more to come over the next 9 months or so. Basically, everyone there is saying that it's hot. So the film actually ended where I'd just like to run through a few of the active weather stations at the moment. The first of which is in Iceland, and it's with a work by Ronnie Horn called the Library of Water. It's actually a long-term project which opened 15 years ago, and is a kind of long-term weather report. So the Library of Water is located in this former library building in Stykkishólmur. It's a town on the west coast of Iceland, on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. And where once there was a library of books, the Library of Water now houses other kinds of collections. There's a collection of water, glacial water, collected from 24 glaciers around the island. Next. The ice was then melted, next please, to fill 24 identical glass columns. And at the bottom of each column, next please, micro-landscapes formed themselves from mineral particles frozen in the ice, which were dust from volcanic activity. And glaciers are one of the most immediate measuring devices of the effects of the climate emergency. The equation is simple. A heating planet leads to melting ice. Meter by meter, year by year, the glaciers recede. In 2014, one of the glaciers from which the water was taken, called Okioku, was declared dead. There was no more glacier anymore. Then there's a collection of words, you can see here, words on the floor of the library, and I'm going to accelerate a little bit. So, and the collection of observations and recollections gathered from 100 people living on the peninsula, farmers, fishermen, teachers, students, which Ronnie Horn edited into this book called Weather Reports You. And the writer Einar Faller Ingolfsson has been the weather reporter at Vatnasatten at the Library of Water this year, creating a year-long weather diary. And the very first weather reports ever made in Iceland, made by a man called Arni Thorlacius, were made in this very same location in Stykkishólmur from 1845 to the late 1870s. And so Einar Faller is mixing his daily observations from today, as it were, in a dialogue with weather reports from the same place in Iceland 170 years ago. And besides recording the daily weather and writing his weather diary, Einar Faller is photographing shelters from storms on the peninsula and sites, next please, where extraordinary weather events have happened. The icebergs that, onto the next one now, next page. The icebergs that shear off the ice pack in Greenland and drift south in the Atlantic Ocean past the east coast of Canada are another clear barometer of the climate crisis. Fogo Island in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada has a front row seat on what's called Iceberg Alley, which is the annual passage of the icebergs coming down from Greenland past the islands. And majestic though they are, these icebergs, they're appearing earlier and earlier, and it's not a good sign. The coastal location on the island is the site of a project by Fogo Island Arts and an artwork by Liam Gillick, an artist who's for several years made reference to the work of the eminent Japanese climatologist Tsuruku Manabe. And Gillick's project, which is called a variability quantifier, opened last month. And the structure is modelled on the traditional fishing stage structures commonly found on the island. And it will function as an operational weather station, sharing real-time weather data and gathering local stories about the weather from people living on the island. You won't be surprised to hear that, like the glaciers in Iceland, the glaciers in New Zealand are also rapidly receding as a result of the rising temperature. And the rate of change there is also the fastest recorded ever. The Tasman Glacier is the largest glacier on the South Island. I think maybe the next slide. And the glacier was formed in Maori legend from the deep exhalation of the ancestor Araki. And the weather report from the glacier is called Haupapa. That's the name, the Maori name for the glacier, Haupapa, the chilled breath of Rakamaumau. The glacial ice is the chilled breath of the glacier, and tiny bubbles of this ancient breath are pressed inside the ice, including pollens, carbon dioxide, as well as the ash of Australian fires. And as the climate heats up, the icebergs break off the glacier, and the chilled breath, the ice of Haupapa, is melting before their eyes and ours. And this is actually one of the sort of indigenous voices, a man called Ron Bull, who's explaining the significance of the glacier. And the bringing together of different kinds of knowledge, indigenous and scientific, imaginative and empirical, in a spirit of mutual respect, is an important aspect of World Weather Network. And listening to what are now called non-human voices, mountains, glaciers, rivers, rocks, plants, animals, and hearing what they can tell us is increasingly important. And as you will know, there's a non-human voice upstairs in Moon and JEON's installation, which we'll come on to later. So much of the early research into glaciers was undertaken here in the Swiss Alps. And earlier this year, artist Jakob Kutsch-Stinson and writer Joel Knenen went on a research trip to the Arola Glacier high in the Swiss Alps for a project that reflects on the relationship of lichens, weather and time. It's one of a number of projects under the theme Lichens Never Lie, or you could say lichens always tell the truth, that takes lichens as both metaphor and measure. And on their expedition to this glacier, they came across a glacial cave about 200 meters deep. And inside, next please, a tiny wolf lichen trapped in a droplet of Arola pine sap. And here's an excerpt from Stinson's video, still a work in progress. And while this plays for a minute, I'm just going to read you an excerpt from Kyungwon's writing. The cracks and low rolling thunder of small avalanches echoed through the valley, an ominous denouement as spring was certainly coming early this year. Once the glacier is gone, the mountain slopes will become more barren, and the Alps will begin to look like Pyrenees, dry scrubland with spring waterfalls and autumn fires. So the next weather station is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, located on the edge of the Great Salt Lake in the western United States. And today, 50 years after it was created, Spiral Jetty is also a barometer for the climate emergency. So this was the lake 50 years ago, and this is the lake now. So the largest salt lake in the world, actually in the Western Hemisphere, might conceivably disappear this century. And the sculpture is no longer a jetty in the water, but a rocky walkway over a parched earth. It will now outlast the lake. So for the moment, the changing climate here is writing its own weather report. But next year, commissioned by the Holt Smithson Foundation, the Native American poet, activist and artist Layli Long-Soldier will write a poetic report reflecting on the ever-changing conditions in the Salt Lake and across the southwest of the United States. So we're going to move to the Amazon rainforest and a project called Other Scores of Water by the Peruvian artist Luz Maria Bedoya. And she'll be reporting from locations in the Andes and the Amazon rainforest in Peru. So from an observation point 2,500 meters high, she talks with a conservationist about water in the rainforest. And they call these forms cloud forests or flying rivers. And they talk about, next please, and they talk about how the cloud forests above the trees have a complex relationship with the moss on the forest floor. So once more, we're moving from atmospheric pressures in the sky to realities on the ground, what we could call ground truths, human and non-human. So when the trees are felled in the rainforest, which, as you know, it's happening very quickly, the moss can no longer survive and the water cycle is radically changed. And the whole thing is like, in Luz Maria's words, it's like a kind of organism that seems where each piece of the organism is meshed with all of the others to make it work. So you take one part away and the ecosystem starts to fall apart. So we'll also go to the other side of the rainforest, to Guyana, where an environmentalist, Sam Airy, is working with an artist, Nicola Green. Next slide, please. And they will, next please, they will be talking with, and next please, talking with the local farming community about their experience of weather, the words that they use again, and sort of combining these local reflections with real-time weather data captured from the Rainforest Center. So you'll have the picture by now that water, in all of its forms, is running through the World Weather Network. It's vital to every station. Next, please. So in Iraq, there's an artist called Sherko Abbas, he's taking a weather station on a raft from Kurdistan in the north of Iraq, down the Tigris River to the Mesopotamian marshes in the Persian Gulf. And as the raft makes its journey, he both gathers measurements about wind and rain, but also gathers stories from local fishermen and farmers about their experience of the weather. So it's a silent movie, but this is someone singing about what will happen as the climate changes in northern Iraq. And in India, there's a weather project which cuts across the 28th parallel north. That's a line that runs from Mount Everest in the east all the way through Rajasthan to the deserts of Rajasthan and into Pakistan. So this is an extraordinary structure called the Moon Stepwell in a village of Abaneri, just before the desert starts in Rajasthan. So this was a place where people stopped, and not just humans, but also migrating birds that amazingly carry the memory of where the water is on their journey over thousands of miles. So they rest to quench their thirst before making the journey across the desert. I think this is actually Bangladesh, where there's a project in Dhaka, and the project takes the name of the word Bona. Now Bona is in Bengali the word for flood, but actually it's a name given to girls in Bangladesh, because flood in Bangladesh doesn't always mean disaster. You know, flood also means sustenance. It's the way that the crops are irrigated. And we're working with Dhaka Art Summit next year, who are using the idea of Bona, invoking Bona as a character, allowing her to speak from Bangladesh to the world about the choices that our future depends on. This is actually the first report which was made by a group of children talking about drought and floods in Bangladesh. So then, this is a still from the weather station in Manila in the Philippines, and a project by Derek Tumala called Tropical Climate Forensics. And it's based on this observatory. This is a model of the Manila Observatory, which was the oldest meteorological observatory in Southeast Asia. And Derek Tumala's project comes in the form of a game, an online game. And he's been building several biomes or dioramas specific to the Philippines as a tropical site. And you're invited to move back and forth across time. I think the next one, please. And play that too. Move back and forth in time, and as you go up, different kinds of information and speculation appear as you navigate your way through his weather station. Finally, we come to Seoul. So we've seen reports of receding glaciers and flying rivers and floods. And temperatures and sea levels are rising. And it's now not a question of whether this is happening, it's a question of how much and how fast. And this is where I think the vast expanse of water in Moon and JEON's fantastic installation to build a fire is coming from. It's flooding into the Art Sonje. And the water, it's like a worldwide deluge as a result of the climate emergency. And the title of their project, To Build a Fire, comes from Jack London's story of an adventurer in the Yukon territory in North America, written 100 years ago. And the man is sure of his own ability to survive, but in the extreme cold, he doesn't, and he dies. So they update Jack London's tale to a speculative future, but one which is no longer unimaginable. And the story is told, as I'm sure you've all seen, from the perspective of the stone or the rock in the gallery, and shaped by artificial intelligence, which raises vital questions of our agency and responsibility. So there's a solitary figure floating in a capsule in a vast expanse of water, and the robotic creature prowls the territory in front of the video. And perhaps he's the only survivor in a future where rising seas have washed away much of humankind, and with it the hubristic belief that strength of will alone will overcome our existential predicament. So there's a too-quick survey of some of the weather stations. You'll see it's an archipelago of weathers and a polyphony of voices and languages embracing different ways of experiencing and describing the weather. So the English writer John Ruskin, going back to the 19th century one last time, spent over 50 years observing clouds and drawing rocks. He was an obsessive weather watcher, and in the 1870s he began to see a new kind of weather, which he called plague clouds. Obviously the plague clouds were coming from the factories burning coal as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So this pollution was to Ruskin a sign of both a moral and an environmental crisis. What is best to be done? Ruskin asked in his famous lecture, The Storm Clouds of the 19th Century. The answer is plain, he said. Whether you can affect the signs of the sky or not, you can the signs of the times. Thank you.
감사합니다.